The dark side of the flesh, what the Bible warns you about. There is a war that most people feel but cannot fully explain. It is not a war fought with weapons, nor is it visible to the human eye, yet it shapes decisions, destroys destinies, and silently pulls countless lives away from the purpose God intended. The Bible calls this unseen force the flesh. It is not merely the physical body, nor is it simply human weakness. It is a deeply rooted inclination within humanity that opposes God at its core. This is the dark side of the flesh. From the very beginning, Scripture reveals that humanity was created in purity, in alignment with God, in perfect harmony with His will. But something changed. Sin entered the world, and with it came a fracture, not only in the relationship between humanity and God, but within humanity itself. Since then, every person has lived with an internal conflict, a tension between what is right and what is desired, between what is holy and what is tempting. The Apostle Paul describes this battle in a way that is both raw and deeply relatable. He writes about wanting to do good, but finding himself doing the opposite. He speaks of a law within him that wages war against his mind. This is the reality of the flesh. It is not passive. It is active, aggressive, and persistent. It whispers, it pulls, it convinces, and often it deceives. The danger of the flesh is not always obvious. It does not always appear as something clearly evil. In fact, its most dangerous form is subtle. It can disguise itself as desire, ambition, pleasure, or even necessity. It can convince a person that something harmful is harmless, or that something sinful is justified. And over time, what begins as a small compromise can become a pattern, and what becomes a pattern can become a prison. The Bible does not ignore this reality. It confronts it directly. It warns, it explains, and it offers a path out. But before anyone can walk in freedom, they must first understand the enemy within. They must recognize that the greatest battle is not always external, it is internal. This is why understanding the dark side of the flesh is not optional for a believer. It is essential, because what you do not understand, you cannot overcome, and what you underestimate, you will eventually surrender to. In this journey, we will go deep into what the Bible reveals about the flesh, its nature, its influence, its strategies, and its consequences. But more importantly, we will uncover the truth that leads to victory, because while the flesh is powerful, it is not undefeatable. And while the struggle is real, so is the freedom. The true nature of the flesh, more than just human weakness. To understand the danger of the flesh, we must first dismantle one of the most common misconceptions, the idea that the flesh is simply human imperfection or occasional weakness. The Bible presents something far more serious. The flesh is not just a part of you that makes mistakes. It is a force within you that actively resists God. When Scripture uses the term flesh, especially in the New Testament, it is often referring to what theologians call the sinful nature. It is the part of humanity that is bent away from God, inclined towards self, and driven by desires that are not aligned with truth. It is not neutral. It is not harmless. It is, by nature, in opposition to the Spirit. This is why Paul writes that the flesh and the Spirit are in conflict with each other. They are not partners. They are enemies. One leads toward life, the other toward destruction. One seeks God, the other seeks self. And every day, every person lives in the tension between these two forces. The flesh operates through desires, what the Bible calls lusts. But these desires are not limited to obvious sins. They include pride, envy, selfish ambition, greed, and even the need for control. The flesh does not only manifest in actions, it begins in thoughts, in intentions, in hidden motivations that often go unnoticed. This is what makes it so dangerous. The flesh rarely announces itself. It works quietly, subtly influencing decisions, shaping perspectives and justifying behavior. It can make a person believe they are right when they are wrong. It can make sin feel normal and righteousness feel restrictive. Consider how often people say, "This is just who I am." That statement, while it may seem harmless, can actually be a reflection of the flesh being accepted as identity. But the Bible challenges this idea. It teaches that what we naturally are is not always what we were meant to be. The flesh tells you to follow your heart. The Bible tells you that the heart can be deceitful. The flesh tells you to do what feels right. The Bible warns that what feels right can lead to destruction. This contrast reveals a critical truth. The flesh cannot be trusted as a guide. Another key aspect of the flesh is its persistence. It does not disappear simply because someone believes in God. Even after spiritual awakening, the presence of the flesh remains. This is why believers still struggle. This is why temptation still exists. Salvation does not remove the battle, it changes the outcome of the battle. The flesh is also deeply connected to identity. It constantly tries to redefine who you are. It pulls you back into old patterns, old mindsets, and old behaviors. It reminds you of your past, not to heal you, but to trap you. It whispers lies like, "You'll never change," or "This is just how you are." But the Bible counters this with a powerful truth. You are not defined by the flesh. You are called to live according to the Spirit. This means that while the flesh may still be present, it no longer has authority unless you give it that authority. This brings us to one of the most important realities about the flesh. It thrives on agreement. It gains power when it is fed, when it is entertained, when it is justified. Every time a person chooses the flesh over the Spirit, they strengthen its influence. But every time they resist, they weaken its hold. The dark side of the flesh is not just in what it does, it is in what it leads to. Left unchecked, it does not remain small. It grows, it deepens, it expands into every area of life. What begins as a thought can become a habit. What becomes a habit can shape a destiny. This is why the Bible speaks so strongly about crucifying the flesh. It is not a gentle suggestion, it is a call to action. Because the flesh does not negotiate, it does not compromise, it seeks control. And if you do not confront it, it will eventually consume you. But here is where hope enters the story. The Bible does not just expose the problem, it provides the solution. It reveals that through the Spirit, through discipline, through awareness, and through surrender to God, the power of the flesh can be broken. Not instantly, not effortlessly, but truly. The first step is recognition, seeing the flesh for what it is, not excusing it, not redefining it, not minimizing it, because only when you see the darkness clearly can you begin to walk in the light. The deception of the flesh, how it tricks you, without you. Noticing. If the true nature of the flesh reveals its opposition to God, then its strategy reveals something even more dangerous: deception. The flesh does not usually operate through obvious rebellion, it operates through subtle persuasion. It does not always shout. Often it whispers, and those whispers are what lead many people into places they never intended to go. One of the greatest mistakes a person can make is assuming that they will recognize temptation when it comes. The reality is far more unsettling. The flesh rarely presents itself as something clearly wrong. Instead, it disguises itself as something reasonable, justifiable, and sometimes even good. This is how deception begins. From the very beginning of Scripture, we see this pattern. The serpent did not approach with an obvious lie. He approached with a question. Did God really say? That question alone introduced doubt, and doubt opened the door for reinterpretation. Suddenly, what was once clear became negotiable, and what was once forbidden became desirable. This is exactly how the flesh works today. It does not immediately push you into sin. It slowly reshapes how you think about it. It reframes it. It softens it. It makes it seem less serious than it actually is. What once felt wrong begins to feel acceptable. What once felt dangerous begins to feel harmless. And all of this happens internally, often without a person even realizing it. The flesh thrives in justification. It creates narratives that protect its desires. It tells you things like, "It's not that bad," or "Everyone does it," or "You deserve this." These statements may seem small, but they carry tremendous power, because once something is justified, it is no longer resisted. This is the turning point. The moment a person stops resisting is the moment the flesh gains ground. Another powerful tactic of the flesh is delay. It rarely tells you to abandon your values completely. Instead, it says, "Just this once," or "You can change later." It pushes consequences into the future while pulling pleasure into the present. It creates a false sense of control, making you believe that you can stop whenever you want. But over time, what was once a choice becomes a pattern, and what becomes a pattern becomes a stronghold. This is why so many people find themselves trapped in cycles they once believed they could control. It didn't start with a major fall. It started with a small compromise, a thought entertained, a boundary crossed, a conviction ignored. The flesh also distorts identity. It does not just influence what you do, it influences how you see yourself. After repeated compromise, it begins to plant deeper lies. It shifts from "this is something you did" to "this is who you are." And once a person begins to believe that lie, change feels impossible. This is one of the darkest aspects of the flesh. Because if a person believes they cannot change, they will stop trying. The Bible speaks directly against this deception. It reminds believers that their identity is not rooted in their failures, but in what God has done for them. But the flesh fights this truth. It constantly tries to pull a person back into a mindset of defeat, shame, and limitation. Another way the flesh deceives is by redefining good and evil. Over time, repeated exposure to certain behaviors or environments can desensitize a person. What once shocked them no longer affects them. What once convicted them no longer bothers them. This is not because the behavior has changed, but because their sensitivity has. The flesh thrives in this desensitization. Because when something no longer feels wrong, it becomes easier to embrace. This is why guarding the mind is so critical, because the battle does not begin with actions. It begins with thoughts. The flesh plants ideas, suggestions, images, and narratives, and if those are not challenged, they begin to take root. This is why Scripture emphasizes renewing the mind. Because transformation does not happen by accident, it happens intentionally. If the mind is not renewed, it will default to the patterns of the flesh. The flesh also manipulates emotions. It can use feelings like loneliness, anger, frustration, or even boredom as entry points. It tells you that acting on those feelings will bring relief, and sometimes, temporarily, it does. But that relief is short-lived, because the root problem is never addressed. It is only covered. This creates a cycle. A person feels something uncomfortable. The flesh offers a quick solution. The person acts on it. They experience temporary relief. But later they feel worse, often with added guilt or regret. And then the cycle repeats. This is how the flesh traps people, not through force, but through patterns. And the longer the pattern continues, the stronger it becomes. One of the most subtle deceptions of the flesh is comparison. It tells you to look at others and measure yourself against them. It can make you feel justified by pointing to someone worse. At least I'm not like them. Or it can make you feel defeated by pointing to someone better. I'll never be like that. In both cases, the focus shifts away from truth because the standard is no longer God, it becomes other people. This distortion keeps a person stuck, either in pride or in discouragement, but never in growth. The flesh also resists accountability. It prefers isolation, because in isolation its voice becomes louder. There is no correction, no challenge, no external perspective, just internal justification. This is why many people drift further when they disconnect from truth, community, or guidance, because the flesh grows strongest in silence. But perhaps the most dangerous deception of the flesh is this. It makes you believe you are in control when you are not. It convinces you that you can manage it, that you can handle it, that you can stop whenever you choose. But the reality is, the more it is fed, the more control it gains. And by the time a person realizes the depth of that control, they often feel trapped. But here is the truth that breaks the deception. The flesh only has power when it is believed. Its strength comes from agreement, from acceptance, from unchallenged thoughts. The moment a person begins to question it, to confront it, to bring it into the light, it begins to lose its grip. This is why awareness is so powerful, because deception cannot survive exposure. When you begin to recognize the patterns, the thoughts, the justifications, the cycles, you begin to see the flesh for what it truly is, not a harmless part of you, but a force that must be confronted. And once you see it clearly, you are no longer as easily controlled by it, but recognizing deception is only the beginning. Because the next question becomes even more important. What happens if the flesh is not resisted? That is where the consequences begin to unfold, and that is what we will uncover next. The consequences of the flesh. What happens when you don't resist it? There is a moment in every internal battle where a decision is made. It may feel small, almost insignificant. A thought entertained a little longer than it should be. A compromise that seems harmless. A quiet yes where there should have been a firm no. In that moment, nothing dramatic appears to happen. There is no visible collapse, no immediate consequence, no external alarm. And that is precisely what makes the flesh so dangerous, because the consequences of the flesh are rarely immediate, but they are always inevitable. The Bible consistently warns that the flesh leads somewhere. It is not static. It does not remain contained. It moves, it grows, it develops. What begins internally eventually manifests externally, and what is tolerated in private will eventually shape public reality. This is the law of spiritual cause and effect. At first, the consequences are subtle, almost unnoticeable. A slight dulling of conviction, a reduced sensitivity to what is right and wrong. Things that once stirred your conscience begin to feel normal. The inner voice that once corrected you becomes quieter, not because it has disappeared, but because it has been repeatedly ignored. This is the first consequence: desensitization. The more the flesh is indulged, the less resistance you feel toward it. What once felt like a struggle becomes easier, but this ease is not freedom. It is surrender. It is the slow erosion of spiritual awareness. And this is where many people are deceived, because they interpret the absence of struggle as growth, when in reality, it is often decline. The next consequence is internal division. When a person lives according to the flesh while knowing the truth, something begins to fracture inside. There is a disconnect between what they believe and how they live. This creates tension, restlessness, and often a sense of inner conflict that cannot easily be explained. This is why people who feed the flesh often feel unsettled, even when everything around them seems fine. Because peace is not just about external conditions, it is about internal alignment. And when that alignment is broken, peace is replaced with unease. Over time, this internal division leads to confusion. The lines between right and wrong begin to blur. Decisions become harder. Clarity fades. A person may begin to question things they once understood clearly, not because the truth has changed, but because their perception has been altered. This is another consequence of the flesh: distortion. It does not just influence behavior, it alters perception. It makes it harder to see clearly, to think clearly, and to choose wisely. As this continues, the consequences become more visible. Habits begin to form. What was once occasional becomes frequent. What was once resisted becomes routine. The flesh thrives on repetition, because repetition creates familiarity, and familiarity reduces resistance. This is how strongholds are formed. A stronghold is not created overnight. It's built over time through repeated agreement with the flesh. Each time a person chooses the same path, the pattern deepens, and eventually it becomes so ingrained that it feels automatic. This is when people begin to say things like, "I can't stop." But the truth is, what feels impossible was once optional. And this is why the Bible warns about the progression of sin. It begins with desire. Desire leads to action. Action leads to habit. And habit, if left unchecked, leads to destruction. Not always immediate destruction, but gradual, cumulative, and often irreversible damage. Another consequence of the flesh is the loss of spiritual strength. Just as the body weakens without proper nourishment, the spirit weakens when it is not fed. And the flesh feeds on the opposite of what strengthens the spirit. It thrives on distraction, indulgence, and self-centeredness. Over time, this creates imbalance. The flesh grows stronger while the spirit grows weaker, and when that balance shifts too far, resistance becomes harder. Not because the person has lost the ability to resist, but because they have lost the strength to do so consistently. This is why discipline is so important, because without it, the natural tendency is to drift toward the flesh. Another deeply serious consequence is the impact on relationships. The flesh is inherently self-focused. It prioritizes personal desire over truth, over love, and over responsibility. This inevitably affects how a person treats others. It can lead to dishonesty, manipulation, selfishness, and emotional distance. And often, these effects are not immediately recognized because the flesh justifies them. It tells you that your actions are reasonable, that your feelings are valid, that your reactions are justified. But over time, the damage becomes clear. Relationships strain. Trust erodes, connection weakens, because anything built on the flesh cannot sustain what requires truth. The consequences also extend to purpose. Every person has a calling, a direction, a path that aligns with God's design. But the flesh pulls in the opposite direction. It distracts, delays, and derails. It keeps a person focused on immediate gratification rather than long-term fulfillment. This is why many people feel stuck, not because they lack potential, but because they are being pulled away from it. The flesh does not always destroy purpose outright. Sometimes it simply delays it. It keeps a person busy with things that do not matter while neglecting what does. And years can pass in this state, years of potential lost, not through a single decision, but through a series of small ones. Perhaps one of the most sobering consequences of the flesh is spiritual separation, not in the sense of God abandoning a person, but in the sense of a person becoming distant from God. Communication feels weaker, sensitivity feels duller, connection feels harder. And again, this does not happen instantly. It happens gradually. A missed moment here, a compromised decision there, a pattern that slowly forms, until one day a person realizes they are not where they used to be, and they cannot easily explain how they got there. This is the nature of the flesh. It does not push you off a cliff. It leads you down a path, step by step, quietly, slowly, until you are far from where you started. But here is the truth that must be understood. None of these consequences are random. They are the natural result of feeding the flesh. Just as a seed produces fruit according to its kind, the flesh produces outcomes according to its nature, and those outcomes are never aligned with life, peace, or purpose. But this is not where the story ends. Because while the consequences are real, they are not irreversible. The Bible does not just warn about the flesh, it provides a way out, a way to break the cycle, a way to regain clarity, a way to restore what was lost. But that path requires something that the flesh resists more than anything else: discipline. And that is where the next part of this journey leads. Because understanding the consequences is not enough. You must also learn how to fight back. The battle against the flesh, how to break its power and take back control. Once a person begins to truly understand the nature of the flesh, its deception, and its consequences, a new question naturally rises: how do I overcome it? Because awareness alone is not enough. You can recognize the patterns, see the damage, and still feel stuck in the same cycle. This is where many people become frustrated. They know what is wrong, but they do not know how to break free. The Bible is very clear about one thing: the flesh is not defeated by willpower alone. This is one of the most important truths to understand. Many people try to fight the flesh using sheer determination. They make promises to themselves, they set boundaries, they try to be better, and for a while it may even work. But eventually, something gives. The same patterns return. The same struggles resurface. And the person is left wondering why they cannot sustain change. The reason is simple but difficult to accept. The flesh cannot be managed. It must be crucified. This language is strong, intentional, and necessary, because the flesh does not respond to negotiation. It does not respect partial resistance. It does not weaken through compromise. It must be confronted directly, decisively, and consistently. But what does that actually look like in real life? The first step in breaking the power of the flesh is spiritual alignment. The Bible teaches that victory over the flesh comes through the Spirit. This means that the battle is not just behavioral, it is spiritual. You are not simply trying to change actions, you are shifting what controls your life. When a person begins to walk in alignment with the Spirit, something changes internally. The same desires may still exist, but they no longer have the same authority. There is a new voice, a new direction, a new strength that was not there before. This is not instant perfection. It is progressive transformation, and it begins with one critical decision: choosing to stop living on autopilot. Because the flesh thrives in unconscious living. It feeds on habits, routines, and reactions that go unquestioned. But the moment a person becomes intentional about their thoughts, their choices, their environment, the dynamic begins to shift. This leads to the second key: discipline. Discipline is often misunderstood. Many people see it as restriction, limitation, or even punishment. But in reality, discipline is protection. It is the structure that guards your freedom. Without discipline, the flesh will always take control, because the flesh seeks comfort, ease, and immediate gratification. It avoids effort. It resists resistance. It wants what is easy, not what is right. So discipline becomes the act of choosing what is right, even when it is not easy. This can take many forms. It may mean controlling what you expose your mind to, because what you consistently see, hear, and think about will shape your desires. If you feed your mind with things that strengthen the flesh, you should not be surprised when the flesh grows stronger. It may mean creating boundaries. Boundaries are not signs of weakness, they are signs of wisdom. They recognize that certain environments, situations, or influences trigger the flesh more easily. And instead of testing your strength unnecessarily, you remove the opportunity. Because sometimes the strongest decision is not to fight harder, but to step away sooner. Another essential element is renewing the mind. The battle against the flesh is largely a battle of thought. Before any action happens, a thought is entertained. Before any habit forms, a pattern of thinking is established. This is why Scripture emphasizes the transformation of the mind. If your thinking does not change, your behavior will not change sustainably. Renewing the mind means replacing lies with truth. It means recognizing the thoughts that come from the flesh and actively rejecting them. It means not accepting every idea that enters your mind as valid. Because not every thought is yours. Some are suggestions, and you have the authority to accept or reject them. This process takes time. It requires consistency. But over time, it reshapes how you perceive things. What once seemed desirable begins to lose its appeal. What once felt difficult becomes more natural. This is how real change happens, not through force but through transformation. Another critical aspect of overcoming the flesh is accountability. The flesh thrives in isolation, but it weakens in exposure. When a person keeps everything internal, the flesh has more room to operate. There is no challenge, no correction, no external perspective. But when things are brought into the light through trusted relationships, guidance, or mentorship, the power of secrecy is broken. Because the flesh depends on hiddenness, and once something is exposed, it loses much of its control. This is not about shame, it is about freedom. It is about refusing to let the flesh operate unchecked. Another key principle is consistency over intensity. Many people approach change with bursts of motivation. They try to overhaul everything at once. They push hard for a short period, but then burn out. And when they fall hard. But lasting victory is not built on intensity. It is built on consistency, small, repeated decisions, daily alignment, moment-by-moment awareness. This is how the power of the flesh is gradually broken, not through one dramatic victory, but through 1,000 quiet ones. There is also an important truth that must be faced. The battle will not disappear. Even as you grow, even as you strengthen, the presence of the flesh remains. But its power changes. It no longer dominates. It becomes something you learn to overcome. This is why the Bible describes it as a daily process, not a one-time event. Each day presents new choices, new opportunities to align with the Spirit or give in to the flesh. And each choice matters. But here is where encouragement becomes essential, because while the battle is real, you are not fighting alone. The strength required to overcome the flesh does not come solely from you. It comes from God working within you. It is not about being perfect. It is about being surrendered. And surrender is not weakness. It is strategy. Because the moment you stop relying only on your own strength, you begin to access a strength that is greater than yours. This changes everything. It shifts the focus from trying harder to living differently, from striving to surrender, from control to trust. And in that shift, something powerful happens. The flesh begins to lose its grip, not instantly, but progressively. And over time, what once controlled you becomes something you can overcome. But there is still one final truth that must be understood. Because overcoming the flesh is not just about stopping something, it is about becoming something. And that is where the final part of this journey leads. The transformation that happens when the flesh no longer defines you. Life beyond the flesh. What happens when you truly walk in the Spirit? There is a moment, quiet, often unnoticed, when something begins to change inside a person who has been fighting the flesh. It is not always dramatic. There are no sudden flashes of light or overwhelming emotional experiences. Instead, it is subtle, steady, and deeply transformative. It is the moment when the flesh is no longer in control, not because it has disappeared, but because something greater has taken its place. This is what the Bible describes as walking in the Spirit, and this is where everything changes. For most people, the conversation about the flesh focuses on what to avoid, what to resist, what to stop doing. But the deeper truth is this. Freedom is not just about what you leave behind. It is about what you step into, because if all you do is fight the flesh without replacing it with something stronger, the battle will feel endless. But when you begin to walk in the Spirit, the dynamic shifts completely. The focus is no longer on constant resistance, it becomes alignment. And alignment produces transformation. One of the first things that happens when a person begins to truly walk in the Spirit is a change in desire. This is one of the most powerful signs of real transformation. Because at the beginning of the journey, doing what is right often feels difficult. It requires effort, discipline, and conscious decision-making. The flesh pulls in one direction, and the person must resist it actively. But over time, something begins to shift. What once felt like a struggle begins to feel natural, not because the person has become perfect, but because their desires have been reshaped. This is the work of the Spirit. It does not just change behavior, it changes what you want. And when desire changes, everything becomes easier. The things that once tempted you lose their power, not because they have disappeared, but because they no longer appeal to you in the same way. The internal pull weakens, the urgency fades, and in its place, a new kind of desire emerges. A desire for peace, for truth, for alignment, for purpose. This leads to the next transformation, inner peace. The flesh is restless by nature. It is always wanting more, always chasing something, always unsatisfied. Even when it gets what it wants, the satisfaction is temporary. It quickly moves on to the next desire, the next craving, the next distraction. This creates a cycle of constant pursuit without lasting fulfillment. But the Spirit operates differently. When a person is aligned with the Spirit, there is a sense of stability, a quiet confidence, a peace that is not dependent on circumstances. It does not mean life becomes easy, but it means the internal state is no longer chaotic. This peace is not something you manufacture. It is something you experience as a result of alignment. And once you experience it, you begin to realize how restless life in the flesh truly was. Another major transformation is clarity. The confusion that once dominated your thinking begins to fade. Decisions become clearer, priorities become more defined. The noise that once clouded your judgment quiets down. Because the Spirit brings order, it helps you see things as they are, not as the flesh wants you to see them. This clarity affects every area of life. Relationships become healthier because they are no longer driven by selfish desire. Decisions become wiser because they are no longer based on impulse. Purpose becomes clearer because distractions lose their grip. You begin to live with intention, not reaction. This is one of the greatest shifts that happens beyond the flesh. You stop being controlled by your emotions, your impulses, and your environment, and you begin to operate from a place of awareness and direction. Another powerful result is freedom. Not the kind of freedom the flesh promises, the freedom to do whatever you want, but real freedom. The freedom to not be controlled, the freedom to say no, the freedom to choose what is right even when it is difficult, the freedom to live without being pulled in every direction by every desire. This is a deeper kind of freedom, because it is not about external options, it is about internal control. And this kind of freedom changes how you experience life. You are no longer reacting, you are choosing. You are no longer driven, you are guided. You are no longer trapped, you are free. But perhaps the most profound transformation is identity. When a person lives according to the flesh, their identity is often tied to their struggles. They see themselves through the lens of their failures, their weaknesses, their patterns. They begin to define themselves by what they cannot overcome. But when a person walks in the Spirit, that identity begins to shift. They no longer see themselves as someone who is constantly failing, but as someone who is being transformed. They begin to understand that their value is not determined by their past, but by what God has declared about them. This changes how they think, how they act, and how they see their future, because identity drives behavior, and when identity is aligned with truth, behavior follows. This does not mean the struggle disappears completely. There are still moments of temptation, still moments of weakness, still moments where the flesh tries to regain influence. But the difference is this: it no longer defines you. It no longer controls you. It no longer has the final say, and that changes everything, because now, when you fall, you do not stay down. When you struggle, you do not surrender. When the flesh speaks, you recognize its voice, and you reject it. This is maturity, not perfection, but growth. Consistent, intentional, ongoing growth. And over time, that growth becomes visible, not just to you, but to others. Your reactions change, your priorities shift, your presence feels different because something inside you has changed. And that change cannot be hidden. This is the life beyond the flesh, not a life without struggle, but a life with victory, not a life of constant defeat, but a life of increasing freedom, not a life defined by weakness, but a life shaped by transformation. And this is the invitation the Bible extends to every person, not just to avoid sin, but to step into something greater, to live differently, to think differently, to become different. Because the ultimate goal is not just to escape the power of the flesh, it is to walk in a new kind of life, a life where the internal war no longer controls you, and where the Spirit leads you into something far greater than you ever thought possible.